The desert stretched endless under a sky bruised with twilight, the kind of vastness that swallowed sound and hope alike. The Apache woman stood tall, her silhouette sharp against the fading light, her eyes like polished obsidian scanning the horizon. Her name was Nui, a name whispered in the comps as both a prayer and a warning. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a legend carved from the bones of a world that had crumbled long before she was born. The brand on her shoulder, a jagged spiral burned into her flesh. It was no tattoo, she'd said, her voice low and fierce, cutting through the murmurs of the gathered crowd. It's a brand from the auction, she told them, her words heavy with the truth they all feared. The auction was no mere marketplace, it was a machine of despair, a place where the remnants of humanity were bartered like cattle. Nui had been there, a child sold to the highest bidder, her spirit deemed too wild to tame, yet she'd escaped, her brand a mark of defiance, not ownership. The crowd, a mix of drifters and rebels, hung on her every word, their faces etched with hunger for something more than survival. They'd heard of the ranch, a fortified stronghold where the elite hoarded resources and power, branding those they claimed as property. Nui's story wasn't just hers, it was theirs, a shared wound that bound them in this desolate place. She spoke of the day she'd fled, her bare feet bloodied on the cracked earth, the brand still smoking from the iron. She'd run until the stars were her only guide, swearing she'd never kneel again. Now, she stood before them, not as a victim but as a spark, igniting whispers of rebellion. The brand wasn't just a scar, it was a map to her purpose, a call to dismantle the world that had tried to break her. The crowd stirred, their fear giving way to something fiercer, something Nui had carried all along, a hope. Nui's voice carried over the wind, recounting the auction's cruelty with a clarity that made the air feel heavier. The auctions were held in the shadow of the ranch, a sprawling fortress of steel and stone where the air reeked of rust and despair. She described the platform, slick with sweat and tears, where people were stripped of names and given numbers. Her number had been 472, a digit seared into her memory as deeply as the brand on her skin. The bidders, cloaked in wealth and arrogance, saw only commodities, not souls. Nui had been 12, her eyes defiant even as chains bit into her wrists. Her mother, an Apache healer, had been taken years before, leaving Nui with only stories of resistance and the old songs that held their people's strength. The brand wasn't just a mark, it was a theft, a claim that her body belonged to someone else. But Nui had never belonged to anyone. She'd learned to slip through shadows, to listen to the desert's whispers, to wield a blade with the precision of a hawk's dive. Her escape had been no accident, it was a calculated rebellion, born from nights spent memorizing the guards' patterns and the weak points in the auction's walls. She'd stolen a knife, small but sharp, and cut her way to freedom, leaving a trail of blood that wasn't all her own. The crowd around her now, their faces lit by the flicker of a dying fire, saw not just a woman but a symbol. The ranch's power was alive, she told them, a fragile thing built on fear. Her brand, once a mark of shame, was now her badge of survival, a reminder that she'd outwitted the machine. She spoke of others still trapped, their brands fresh, their spirits bending under the weight of captivity. The crowd's whispers grew into a low hum, a current of resolve. Nui's story wasn't just a tale, it was a call to arms, a challenge to reclaim what had been stolen. The night deepened, and Nui's words wove a tapestry of pain and power. She told of the years after her escape, when the desert became both her refuge and her crucible. Alone, she'd learned to read the land's secrets, where water hid in the roots of cacti, how to track the fleeting shadows of prey. The brand on her shoulder throbbed in those early days, a constant reminder of the world she'd left behind. But it also fueled her, each pulse a vote to never be owned again. She'd found others, scattered survivors who'd fled the ranch or other auctions, their own brands marking them as kin in suffering. Together, they built a fragile community, hidden in canyons where the wind sang of forgotten gods. Nui taught them the songs her mother had sung, songs of warriors who'd fought empires with nothing but courage and cunning. The brand, she explained, wasn't just a scar but a story, a testament to their endurance. She spoke of the ranch's inner workings, pieced together from whispers of those who'd escaped after her. It was a place of excess for the few and misery for the many, where the branded were forced to toil in mines or serve in opulent halls. The elite, Nui said, feared the branded more than they admitted, for each mark was a spark that could ignite rebellion. Her own brand had become a beacon, drawing others to her cause. The crowd listened, their eyes reflecting the fire's glow, their hands tightening around makeshift weapons. Nui's voice grew sharper, urging them to see their own brands visible or Noda as proof of their strength, not their shame. The desert, she said, was vast enough to hide an army, and fierce enough to forge one. The hum of the crowd grew louder, a pulse of defiance that matched the rhythm of her words. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the desert in hues of blood and gold, Nui's story turned to the present. The ranch had grown bolder, its auction spreading like a plague, snatching children from camps and branding them before they could fight. Nui had seen it herself, tracking a caravan to a new auction site, her heart heavy with the screams of the captured. The brand on her shoulder burned as she watched, a reminder of her own past. She'd wanted to storm the site alone, her knife ready, but she knew one blade wasn't enough. That's why she'd called this gathering, pulling together every rebel, drifter, and survivor who'd listen. The crowd around her now was no mere assembly, it was the beginning of something greater. She spoke of a plan, not yet fully formed but rooted in the certainty that the ranch could fall. Her brand, she said, was a map to its weaknesses, a guide to the cracks in its walls. She described the guards' routines, the supply routes, the hidden tunnels she'd found while scouting. The crowd leaned in, their breath held, as she outlined a vision of coordinated strike as small at first, to disrupt, then larger, to destroy. The brand wasn't just a mark of pain, it was a key to their freedom, a symbol that the auction's power was not absolute. Nui's voice rose, steady but fierce, as she called them to action. They were not cattle, she said, not numbers, but people with names and stories, with ancestors who'd fought and survived. The desert, she reminded them, had always been theirs, a place of endurance and rebellion. The crowd's hum became a roar, a promise to fight, to turn their brands into weapons. Nui paused, letting the crowd's energy settle, her eyes scanning their faces for doubt. There was little the fire in their gazes mirrored her own. She spoke of the risks, the blood that would spill, the lives that might be lost. The ranch was no easy target, its walls bristling with weapons, its leaders cunning and cruel. But Nui had seen cruelty before, had felt its weight in the auction's chains, and she'd learned it could be outsmarted. Her brand, still raw in her memory, was proof of that. She told of a boy she'd freed during a raid, his own brand fresh, his eyes wide with fear and gratitude. He'd called her a spirit, the ghost of the desert, but she was flesh and blood, driven by the same rage and hope that now stirred the crowd. The plan, she explained, would start with sabotage, cutting off the ranch's water, burning its supplies, spreading fear among its guards. The branded, she said, were everywhere, even within the ranch's walls, waiting for a spark to rise. Her brand was that spark, a signal that rebellion was possible. She spoke of allies, other camps hidden in the desert, ready to join if the call was strong enough. The crowd nodded, some clutching amulets, others whispering prayers to gods old and new. Nui's voice softened, telling them of her mother's teachings, of a time when their people moved freely, their stories unbroken by brands or auctions. The desert, she said, remembered those days, and it would carry them now. The crowd's roar softened to a chant, their voices blending into a song of resistance, one Nui had taught them, its rhythm echoing the pulse of her brand. The sun climbed higher, its heat a reminder of the desert's unyielding truth. Nui's story turned to the future, to a world where brands were scars of victory, not shame. She spoke of the ranch's leaders, faceless men who hid behind wealth and fear, believing themselves untouchable. But Nui had seen their fear, glimpsed it in the eyes of a guard she'd cornered, his voice trembling as he begged for mercy. Her brand had given her power, not over him, but over the lie that the ranch was invincible. She told the crowd of her dreams, vivid and sharp, where the desert bloomed again, where children ran without fear of auctions. The brand, she said, was not just a mark but a promise, a vow to fight until no one was branded again. She outlined the next steps, scouts to map the ranch's defenses, messengers to unite the scattered camps, warriors to train in the desert's shadows. The crowd listened, their faces set with purpose, their hands no longer trembling. Nui's brand, once a private pain, was now their shared strength, a symbol that bound them as kin. She spoke of sacrifice, of the need to move as one, to strike when the ranch least expected it. The desert, she reminded them, was patient, but it was also fierce, a force that could bury empires. The crowd's chant grew stronger, their voices carrying across the sands, a warning to the ranch that its days were numbered. Nui stood taller, her brand a beacon, her words a fire that would not be quenched. As midday burned the desert, Nui's voice took on a new urgency. She spoke of the children still in the ranch, their brands fresh, their spirits not yet broken. She'd seen them in her scouting, small figures hauling water or scrubbing floors, their eyes holding the same defiance she'd once had. Her brand ached at the memory, a reminder of why she fought. The crowd was no longer just listeners, they were warriors, their resolve hardened by her words. She told them of a weakness in the ranch's eastern wall, a gate poorly guarded at dawn, a chance to slip inside and free the branded. The plan was risky, she admitted, but risk was their language, the tongue of the desert itself. Her brand, she said, was a guide, its spiral a map of the paths they'd take. She spoke of the old ways, of Apache warriors who'd struck from shadows, their names sung in stories that outlived empires. The crowd's chant became a war cry, their voices a storm gathering strength. Nui described the aftermath she envisioned, the ranch in ruins, its auctions silenced, its brands fading into scars of a war won. She called on them to name their own brands, to speak the numbers they'd been given, to reclaim them as badges of survival. The crowd answered, their voices rising in a litany of numbers of 472, 819, 236, a roll call of the unbroken. Nui's brand burned, not with pain but with purpose, a fire that spread to those around her. The desert, she said, was watching, its spirits ready to guide them. The crowd surged forward, ready to follow her, their brands no longer chains but keys to a new world. The sun hung heavy, its light glinting off Nui's brand as she raised her arm, a gesture that silenced the crowd. She spoke of the final step, the strike that would end the ranch's reign. It would begin with a single act. She stuck fire set at the auction's heart, a signal to all the branded that freedom was near. Her brand, she told them, was not just hers but theirs, a shared mark of a people who'd never been broken. She described the chaos they'd sown, the guards scattering, the leaders fleeing as their fortress burned. The crowd's war cry grew deafening, their voices a wave that could drown the desert itself. Nui spoke of the world they'd built, one where brands were stories told to children, not marks burned into flesh. She called on them to move now, to gather their weapons, to send word to the other camps. Her brand, she said, was a vow, a promise that they'd fight until the last auction fell. The crowd surged, their hands raised, their voices a song of defiance that echoed across the sands. Nui stepped forward, her brand a beacon, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the ranch waited. The desert, she said, was theirs, its winds carrying their names, its stones holding their stories. The crowd followed, a tide of rebellion, their brands no longer marks of shame but badges of a war they'd win. Nui led them, her voice a blade, her brand a fire, her heart the desert itself.